Session 4, and we're talking about structure and composition. Structure is basically what you build on. It's the foundation that you lay before you compose your design. And structure is something that we don't usually see. If you think about pouring concrete to create a sidewalk or a driveway or something like that, you know that there's this framework that goes in before the concrete is poured, and it's made up of rebar, and it is kind of a network concept. And what it does is it strengthens the concrete and allows for the concrete to exist without breaking apart or cracking over time. And houses that are built without structured foundations will crumble, the house can split, and things like that over time. So a structure is really important to anything that you're going to build on, including design. So structured we generally understand as a grid. It's basically a network of lines that intersect or crisscross, and they divide space, and they give us an understanding of the amount of little units or little modules that are available within the space. And that can actually be any number. You can double the amount of lines that we have on this graph paper concept here and have smaller units and so forth. And structures also don't need to be exact. You can have structures that are larger in some areas and have more division in other areas. But basically, a structure is going to be something that is divided. Sometimes it'll appear as part of the composition, and other times it just sits underneath. And over here we have basically a 3 across and 3 down concept of a 9 square. But if you'll notice, the way you can actually compose within a structure creates a wide variety. So we have different expressions within the same structure. Each one of these squares is a 3 by 3 setup, but we can basically compose something in many different ways within the same structure. As we look at this poster, we can also understand that structure does not have to be parallel to the edge of the picture plane. Here we have structural lines going this direction and structural lines going the opposite, and they're diagonal. So structures don't need to be straight up and down. We see structure in everything without probably recognizing it. And something like this, a spreadsheet or a flow chart or a calendar, uses a very obvious structure as part of what it does. Here we have a design that's actually composed on little pieces of grid, or there's a graph paper sensibility under here. That's actually the structure, and then the composition is loosely formatted on top of it. But we see the structural element through the composition, and here it actually helps to unify the entire thing together. Structure is really easily understood in floor plan when you actually divide a space into units of width and length. So dealing with a floor plan is a really good understanding. Also in Photoshop, if you work with the gray grid in the background, that's your structure. Or if you work with Illustrator and you invoke the grid to make that visible, that's your structure that you're working on. Just another example of structure and applying the grid, and it's actually an active part of the composition. This, by the way, is a book cover. And here we see the structure concept applied to a website. Obviously the background image is basically a set of 3 up and 3 down squares that are multiplied. But then we see everything, every spatial division is actually based on that format. And so we can have larger areas that are made up of 2 or 3 of these squares, and here each of these images fits within one of those designated squares right here. So it's this high and this wide. Or we can take a whole column and make it wide, but we have 6 or 7 squares high, things like that. So This is a structurally based composition for this website. Structures come in several different varieties or variations, and we can use structure in a very rigid, precise, there's that word mathematical or geometric again, where your spatial divisions are regular and they're really precise. And then there's informal structure where there's a fluidity, where you don't have the same kind of precision within the underlying foundation of your design. An active structure can be formal or informal in understanding, but active is where the structure is actually visible. So if we go back to that web page, we see that the structural lines are visible as part of the final design. Therefore, the structure that on which this design is built is active. Inactive means that the structure is understood through implied line. It's understood through how the elements in the visible composition are placed. And so we look at this layout and we see columns and we see horizontality, we see a lot of implied line going on, and that indicates that the structure is inactive. We don't see those grid lines anywhere, but things in the composition are placed accordingly, according to boundaries or barriers or alignments that are within the structure but are unseen in the final analysis. It's kind of like, again, if you're building a house, you're going to build a solid foundation for the house to sit on. That's your structure. But your structure is not going to be visible. You're going to slap drywall up and then you're going to paint the drywall and things like that, so you won't actually see the framework and the framing of the house. And sometimes garages are unfinished and you do see the structural framework. But if you put up drywall or some other thing that's going to obstruct and cover up that structure, that's the idea of an inactive structure. So we're looking at first of all, the print and then the textile design. We see a very strong regularity and precision in terms of how elements are repeated, and the same thing here. And this actually has a structure that we see spatial divisions this way, vertically, and then we see them horizontally. And here the structural elements are somewhat visible, not exactly, but the blue gutters are actually aligned up on a structural concept, and the space between is actually an equilateral triangle. So again, structures don't need to be square or rectangular either. If we look at the map on the left, we have active structure going on, and that is basically created by all the flight lines and the patterns and the measurement lines and things like that. Those are all structural components of this to indicate distances, divisions of space, and things like that. And it's active because it's visible. It's also irregular, therefore it is informal. This is also informal, and it's informal because the structural elements are there by virtue of implied line, so it's inactive, but nothing is really plumb or level. Things are slightly tweaked. This is a postmodern design, and we do that in postmodern design. And so if you look at this line and this line, they're actually not going the exact same direction as the stress on the T, as the direction of the T or the type down here. So we look at this painting here, we see the structural lines are now active. That space is divided into many facets, basically, many different smaller shapes, and then those shapes are colored compositionally, but the structural lines remain visible. And this poster, a proposal poster for 2012 in San Francisco for the Olympics, the structural lines are there, and notice that there's squares and there's rectangles and there's rectangles. So basically there is an activity, there is a visual understanding of the structure in the final composition. So this makes it active, and the angles are all right angles and so forth, so it is formal. So we look at the baseball typography, which is really kind of cool. It is an inactive structure. In spite of the outlines and everything, the structure is informally curved. And if you were actually to take a piece of tracing paper and overlay it onto this and actually found all the implied lines, you would find that there is a curve and recurve structure going on which the letter forms are based. And so that informality, that curvature, it's more fluid, it's irregular, therefore it is informal. And we don't see it, so it's inactive. In this design, the structural understanding is definitely active, as we see the way the stripes are going. This blob is divided into basically almost a network, a framework, and then it is compositionally colored. And so the structure here is active, and it's definitely informal. When we deal with structure, we're also dealing with the idea of a structural shape. And the shape is basically the overall shape of the design. We've alluded to, the picture plane, the frame of reference, and things like that. A frame of reference is always going to describe a particular shape. In this case, this is an album cover for an LP, and it is actually a square shape. Its aspect ratio is a 1:1. It's the same distance or same measurement from top to bottom as it is side to side. And so then within this we can see indications of structure behind the word pixies, and we can actually see that parts of that structure are slightly visible, parts are invisible, and then we get over here into this diagram. And this is a very structural understanding, and notice it is formal, but it's irregular, so it actually is informal. In other words, how this space is divided, it has a high degree of complexity as you follow all these lines, and it has an informality to it. Another structural shape is rectangular, where one aspect is going to be longer than the other, and the circular actually will be circular. And it can be divided concentrically, meaning things rotate around a center, or they can be divided radially in terms of things kind of going to the center and then moving out toward the edges, more like a clock face as opposed to the Target logo, which would be concentric. So as we look at this piece, we have an informal structure. We have a division of space horizontally that's fairly easy to understand because we've got 4 lines of type. But then we have spatial divisions that are on the diagonal and much more fluid in understanding. If we were to again diagram the general implied lines in this, we would find definitely an informality to the underlying structure, and therefore it is informal. It is inactive because we don't see it, and in the structural shape overall, this is a rectangle. It's horizontally inclined. It's longer on the horizontal than it is on the vertical. So we look at this book cover. Again, it's rectangular in terms of shape. There are active structure and there's also inactive structure going on. The active structure is actually down here in the checkerboard concept, and the rest of it's all inactive because we don't see it. We start seeing a little bit here in some of the letter forms, like in the E, but not a whole lot else. So it has formality, and some of this is informal going on here in the illustration area. And this is all inactive versus this being active. And it's rectangular, pardon me, not rectilinear, so it's longer on the vertical here than it is on the horizontal. As we look at this, there is an informality to how the space is divided. It is active because the spatial divisions are basically the edges of these sets of linear elements. And then we have the diagonal implied lines going on behind, and that has a regularity, but overall this has a strong informality, and it has mostly active elements in terms of the structure, and it's rectangular. So we look at this logo. Obviously, for an aquarium, we notice that there's an informality to it. In terms of how space is divided, we have the area that's sort of the blue, the area that's the orange, and then we have the yellow-green. It is inactive because we don't really see that division in thirds. It's suggested or understood because of how the active elements are working, but the structure itself is unseen. And it's circular. And it's circular in two ways. There is a sense of concentricity as things start wrapping around. It is more, though, radial. There's a sense of things coming here in the center and then basically rotating out or radiating out from the center toward the edge, and those implied lines that are doing that are actually curved. So we look at this piece, the structure is inactive, it's formal, and the overall design is rectangular, rectilinear. Definitely in this hand-drawn type, the structure is informal. It's kind of going all over the place. It looks really spontaneous. There's a lot of liveliness to it. We can't see those structural lines, but you can see that there is, a lot of irregularity and fluidity to the baseline of the type. And it's also a rectangular or rectilinear composition. And this is a luggage tag from, I think, the 50s. It's Norway. I was going to say Finland, but it's Norway. The structure here is formal, it is circular, and it's inactive. And this has a real strong concentricity. So we have the center here, and we have the edge of the orange field rotating around, then we have the edge of the dark blue, and then the lighter blue, and then the radiant points are rotating around. And the edge, of course, is concentric. At the same time, the radiant points are radiating. If we take the implied line straight through the center and out to the other side, we find that they move from the edge to the center and out again. So this is a circular structural shape. I put this here to show the idea basically that structure is your foundation and composition sits on top of it. So it's just a real quick way to get that idea across. As we look at this ad, this is a very famous series of ads in the modernist style, and came about in the 60s and early 70s. But notice the structural overlay that indicates where, basically how it divides space. And the structural unit, the base unit, is the square, and then it's multiplied and then multiplied again. But this is how the space is divided. And so we see the vertical divisions and we see the horizontal divisions in the dotted overlay. Composition, again, sits on top of structure. It's very much the result of what the structure is doing. And as I mentioned previously, you can have the same structure and a ton of different compositional results from it. Composition is basically the totality of the design. It's the sum total of everything that goes into the design. So as we look at this piece, we have obviously the background with the sense of linear perspective. We have the dude in the chaise lounge with the really bright blue suit and his beverage. We have the text box and all of its implied line. We have the red box at the bottom with the type in it. So the composition is not just this or this and this. The composition is everything. Everything within the frame of reference is the composition, whether it's positive space or negative space. And speaking of space, notice also how the negative space is not white. It is actually filled with other stuff. So around this guy and his beverage, and around the text box and above the red box here, all of this is negative space, but it has stuff in it. It has its own figure ground understanding. As we look at the magazine cover, we can see a horizontal division here. We have a lot of implied line. This text is all stuck within a box. And the text is justified, and some words are made larger to fit in and so forth. Over here, the text is aligned against an implied line to the right, and basically we have the dog in a closed composition, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's a closed form because he's framed by everything around him. And but the totality of the design is corner to corner, side to side, top to bottom. Within something as simple as a logo, we still have the totality of the logo. In other words, the icon and the word mark work together as the totality of the composition. In this case, we just have the icon showing these are small variations of ways that this can be used. But the totality of the composition is the D, the negative space with the foot, and then the ellipse here. Within any composition, there is a dominant direction that is understood. And there are four means of, well, direction, shall we say. And each direction has its own kind of personality style. So direction is often understood via implied line, so it can have a structural understanding, but not necessarily. It's stress. The dominant direction is a compositional thing. It relates to composition and less so to structure. So as we look at this photograph, we might see this curve, but that's actually not the dominant direction. The dominant direction is vertical, because that's what most everything is doing. This is actually a secondary direction. Obviously here we've got a tree and sitting on a plot of land with some older tree parts around it. And it is definitely vertically stressed. So vertical stress is a pull from top to bottom. The personality of verticalness relates to monumentality, making things larger than life. When we look up to something, we have to do much more what I'll call physical work. It's very easy to move your head side to side, but we don't as easily look up or down. And that's why people can hide in trees and things like that and go totally unnoticed by people walking by down below, because we don't naturally look up. And so we're always amazed by, you know, the sequoias in California and how tall they are, and we have to actually, you know, crane our necks to be able to see the tops of them. Same thing with really tall buildings in metropolitan areas. Manhattan, you have to really, you know, kind of get physically uncomfortable to see the top of a really tall skyscraper. So that is a monumental thing, something larger than life, something bigger than ourselves. That's what vertical stress can denote. So vertical stress is kind of heroic. Horizontal stress is passive, quiet, peaceful, calm. If you think about just your day-to-day activities, you basically start and end your day in a horizontal position of rest. So generally speaking, people will rest best when they are horizontal. And the horizontal direction, the horizontal stress in a composition is very pastoral, it's very calming, it's soothing, it is restful, it's quiet. It is generally inactive. We have no trouble turning our head side to side to see, you know, a panoramic view, and that's very easy for us. So horizontal stress, the personality is quiet and passive. So obviously here the main division is a horizontal division. The verticality of anything is basically almost non-existent. So this is a really quiet, peaceful scene. So we look at the Ansel photograph. Diagonal stress becomes very obvious. There's nothing in here that is really plumb or level except for the edges, the frame of reference itself. But in relation to that frame of reference, everything else has a diagonal pull. The mountain peaks, even the sense of the horizon, or the sense of the end of the plain and where the foothills begin, is not quite level. and then we have this diagonal here, and so the S-curve creates a diagonal quality, and the diagonals of the peaks also help with the just the dynamic energy. Diagonals are always moving. There's a sense of unrest and high energy and things like that. So if you're creating a design that you want to express an idea of energy, you're going to do things on the diagonal rather than horizontal or vertical. Like this. That's a lot of movement. And the speed is not only in the blur, it's in the really strong diagonal pull from basically upper left to lower right. These horizontal pieces are very much secondary to this. This is your dominant direction, and you cannot miss that. So we're going into warp speed visually. Another compositional stress variation is the cruciform. Cruciform relates to cross, see, you know, like in a crucifix and so forth. So in this composition, what we see is a vertical implied line, and we see a horizontal implied line, and they actually equal each other. One is not more dominant than the other. And we see it even in the obscure pieces in the background. The darker shapes, we have a horizontality to each one of them, but then the relationship to each other is a vertical one. And so this is a very postmodern almost, well actually it's modern moving into postmodern, but it's a cruciform composition. So we look at both of these. They are both cruciform. There is not one particular dominant direction. Here the cruciform is repeated. We have the vertical lines and we have the vertical lines, and then we have horizontal and horizontal, and they actually equal each other. And in this stained glass window, of course we have the verticality of the stems, but then we have the horizontality of the blue bars behind them. This is also cruciform. The blue horizontality actually cancels out the floral verticality, if that makes sense. So cruciform can be highly stabilizing. And these are both actually placed on a horizontal vertical axis, but you can also make things diagonal and still have a cruciform composition. The thing about cruciform is that basically the implied lines of the direction will intersect at right angles, no matter whether the whole thing is oriented straight up and down or it's diagonal, but there's a right angle relationship to things. In this photograph, the compositional stress is vertical, and the main pull is this. The diagonals that are coming in here are actually secondary, and the diagonals that are on the face of the granite are also secondary. Notice the edge tension is the shoulder of the climber actually meets that division line, and that actually flattens space. It's really kind of interesting the angle at which the photographer caught this, because obviously he's the focus, but his relationship to the visual edge of that cliff face totally flattens space, where you have this depth here, and this is really big and in the front, and it's open composition and all of that, and then there's overlap of the cliff face against the landscape in back. There's a bit of atmospheric perspective. We have this relationship right here, and whoops, everything flattens. It's really kind of cool. Compositional stress here is definitely horizontal. The dominant movement is side by side, or side to side. And notice also how the structural shape is lending to that. The actual shape of the structure stresses horizontally. You can have vertical stress within a horizontal structural shape like this, and that happens a lot. For instance, we have a diagonally stressed composition in a horizontal structural shape. So the frame of reference is longer on the horizontal than it is on the vertical, so it's a horizontal structure, but the compositional stress, the movement, is diagonal, and we hope he catches the ball. Unless, of course, you're not a Boston fan. So we look at this website. The compositional stress here is definitely horizontal. The horizontality is repeated through changes in color, edges, things like that all the way through. And so it creates a real strong passiveness and actually stability in the overall space. This is definitely a company that one should trust when one is dealing with commercial properties and things like that. So the horizontality helps create a sense of trust. Another issue to deal with when you're dealing with composition relates to the idea of open form or closed form. And we talked about this when we were dealing with defining plastic space or decorative space. A closed form will flatten space. So in a composition, anything that closes or frames visually kind of creates a surround within the design and separates the viewer from the composition is going to be a closed composition. And so that's what we have here. The entire piece is the square, then we have the smaller square on the diagonal axis, and then we have the people zippered together, and obviously they're cut off. So we have the understanding that there's a framing device that is part of this design. And again, with a closed form, the two-dimensionality, the decorative space, is definitely the thing to understand. Open compositional types help represent deep space more easily. We've talked about that when we were talking about the spatial devices. So this composition obviously is open. And we have, by virtue of blurring in the background, we have a real strong atmospheric perspective effect. And then we have, you know, the Weimaraner Bluebird combination here. And to make this credible, because this could never possibly happen, unless you're a taxidermist, the composition is actually open. So everything bleeds off the edge, and we have a sense of plastic space volumetric illusion. So we are actually part of this. This could actually be our hand and have this bird dog sitting on it. One of the things when we deal with storytelling in design is your compositional type is going to help you tell the story. If we regard this photograph as just, you know, it's a grizzly bear, okay, but if we kind of look at it a little more and realize there's nothing protecting us from the bear, there's nothing there between us and the bear. The bear is mid-ground in the photograph, but there is a sense of, okay, he's still close enough to be concerned, because there's nothing wrapping around the edge that says, okay, it's only a photograph. So psychologically, in terms of the telling of the story here, we are engaging with the bear more directly than if we would, if this were actually framed somehow. And the reason for that is the open composition allows us to actually step into and participate in the story that's going on in the design. Notice, by the way, the really strong diagonal stressing. And this is a Manet, and this is an open composition allowing us to be actually in the boat or in a boat next to this couple. I'm not sure he's looking real happy about it, but you know, there's a story to be told here, and we are basically being addressed by the guy and engaging with the couple fairly easily because it is an open composition. Notice also that it is mostly diagonal, and it's a subtle diagonal. It's not a real strong one. It is the implied line here is kind of lower right up through the arm and you know, the back of the bonnet over here. This is closed. This is from the Congo, and obviously as part of the design itself, within the picture plane you have a framing device. And obviously the human forms are understood as human, but they're highly stylized. They are so abstracted that no human could possibly survive if they look like this. But we still get, because of the just the way the figures are rendered, the height, the emphasis on the thighs and the legs and everything, the figures in their diagonal understanding with each other, we have a sense of huge action and stabilized by the red circle in the middle. But the compositional type is closed. The interesting thing is, what's the stress? It's actually cruciform. And if we understand that there is a horizontal line between these two forms going straight across, and then there's a center line structurally, we find that one axis or one direction equals the other. But because of the action of the figure and the dominance of the figure, it's really hard to discern the cruciform understanding. This illustration is a closed composition, and although it appears to bleed out the edge, there's a very subtle ghosting of the more centered image, or maybe it's that the edge is slightly darker in value and more saturated, but there is a kind of an uneven edge all the way around this that closes the composition and actually takes us away from the activity and so forth. So we are kind of third-hand observers rather than first-hand participants into what's going on in the piece. So, looking at the poster, what do you see? Is this an open or a closed composition? And what's the compositional stress? Is the structure underneath it active or inactive? And is that structure formal or informal? What do you see? Well, it's obviously a closed composition because there's a framing device all the way around the active area. The compositional stress is vertical. The horizontality is not positioned in such a way that it can overtake or be equal to the verticality. So this is vertically stressed. And yes, we do have diagonal and so forth going in here, but the dominant direction is vertical. So this is a vertically stressed composition. The structure is inactive. We understand a spatial division. We understand that there is a center median line. We understand that this distance can be multiplied straight down and end up down here meeting this bottom edge. We understand his placement being equidistant between the two vertical edges of the piece, and it's overall very formalized, which allows for the huge activity of the flames and the radiant lines and everything, and the scalloping of the border to work really well. And we also recognize that it's formal in terms of its structure, and we're picking up through the implied lines and so forth, and even the precision of the radiant lines is indicating a formal structure underneath. So here we have a piece of information graphic. So is this open or closed? Well, you could say that it is open because the gray goes all the way to the edge. But if you notice, there's a margin all the way around. Nothing actually addresses the edge in the active content. It's the white space, the negative space, that hits the edge, but nothing in the active part of the composition hits the edge. So this is closed. The boundary, the frame of reference, is that margin, that separation. Compositional stress. It's horizontal all the way through. Yes, we do have vertical figures, and we've got a few vertical implied lines, but the dominant motion is horizontal. The structural shape, by the way, is a square. The structure is inactive. We don't see it, but we understand it because of how things are lined up. We understand it because there is a margin in there. And it's obviously formal. It is mathematically derived. It's right angles, and everything is parallel. The structure itself is parallel to the edges of the picture plane, and stays that way from top to bottom and side to side. What about this? This is actually closed, which is probably a good thing because, you know, if you've seen the movie, you don't want to be too close to this guy. So he's peering through the door, but the door is acting as a framing device. So he is separated from us, and it's probably a good thing. Compositional stress is vertical all the way through. It is an inactive structure. We don't see it. And then the next question is it formal or informal? It's actually formally structured, and by virtue of how the space is divided, and you know, we see that this is not a fluid, free-form structure. It is formal, which also is helpful in keeping us at a distance from what this is communicating. So this is a 2-page spread. It's a print ad, and if you like Crocs, this is kind of cool. If you think Crocs are kind of interesting, it's a new way of looking at them. So is this an open or closed composition? It's open on the edge. It's kind of closed over here. So it actually has two things going on because she is cropped by the edge and part of the bottom edge. This side is open. There is a margin all the way around, so it's closed. So by virtue of this example, we can understand that parts of a composition can be closed and parts can be open. Most of this would be considered open, and that's what it's leaning toward because the proportion of her bleeding off the edge is minimal compared to the distance that is more closed, and the flow of the margin all the way around. Compositional stress. It's horizontal. Bit of diagonal, but most everything, if you look at the baselines of everything and how things are lined up, it is dominating on the horizontal. The structural shape is rectangular. The structure itself is formal. We can, you know, divide space. There's about the same distance here as to about here, and then the distance between the shoe and her is about the distance of this line of type and things like that. So there is a regularity and a formality to how that space is divided underneath the composition.